It seems incredible that the Indians made these discoveries centuries before Western mathematicians. And it says a lot about our attitude in the West to non-Western cultures that we've nearly always claimed their discoveries as our own.
What is clear is the West has been very slow to give due credit to the major breakthroughs made in non-Western mathematics. Madhava wasn't the only mathematician to suffer this way. As the West came into contact more and more with the East during the 18th and 19th centuries, there was a widespread dismissal and denigration of the cultures they were colonising. The natives, it was assumed, couldn't have anything of intellectual worth to offer the West. It's only now, at the beginning of the 21st century, that history is being rewritten.
But Eastern mathematics was to have a major impact in Europe, thanks to the development of one of the major powers of the medieval world. In the 7th century, a new empire began to spread across the Middle East. The teachings of the Prophet Muhammad inspired a vast and powerful Islamic empire, which soon stretched from India in the east to here in Morocco in the west. And at the heart of this empire lay a vibrant intellectual culture. A great library and centre of learning was established in Baghdad. Called the House of Wisdom, its teachings spread throughout the Islamic Empire, reaching schools like this one here in Fez. Subjects studied included astronomy, medicine, chemistry, zoology, and mathematics.
The Muslim scholars collected and translated many ancient texts, effectively saving them for posterity. In fact, without their intervention, we may never have known about the ancient cultures of Egypt, Babylon, Greece and India. But the scholars at the House of Wisdom weren't content simply with translating other people's mathematics. They wanted to create a mathematics of their own, to push the subject forward.
Such intellectual curiosity was actively encouraged in the early centuries of the Islamic Empire. The Quran asserted the importance of knowledge. Learning was nothing less than a requirement of God.
In fact, the needs of Islam demanded mathematical skill. The devout needed to calculate the time of prayer and the direction of Mecca to pray towards. And the prohibition of depicting the human form meant that they had to use much more geometric patterns to cover their buildings. In fact, the Muslim artists discovered all the different sorts of symmetry that you can depict on a two-dimensional wall.
The director of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad was a Persian scholar called Muhammad al-Khwarizmi. Al-Khwarizmi was an exceptional mathematician who was responsible for introducing two key mathematical concepts to the West.
Al-Khwarizmi recognized the incredible potential that the Hindu numerals had to revolutionize mathematics and science. His work explaining the power of these numbers to speed up calculations and do things effectively was so influential that it wasn't long before they were adopted as the numbers of choice amongst the mathematicians of the Islamic world. In fact, these numbers have now become known as the Hindu Arabic numerals.
These numbers, 1 to 9 and 0, are the ones we use today all over the world. But Al-Khwarizmi was to create a whole new mathematical language. It was called algebra and was named after the title of his book, Al-Jabra wa al-Makbal, or calculation by restoration or reduction. Algebra is the grammar that underlies the way that numbers work. It's a language that explains the patterns that lie behind the behaviour of numbers. It's a bit like a code for running a computer program. The code will work whatever the numbers you feed into the program.
For example, mathematicians might have discovered that if you take a number and square it, that's always one more than if you take the numbers either side and multiply those together. For example, 5 times 5 is 25, which is one more than 4 times 6, 24. 6 times 6 is always one more than 5 times 7, and so on. But how can you be sure that this is going to work whatever numbers you take? To explain the pattern underlying these calculations, let's use the dyeing holes in this tannery.
If we take a square of 25 holes running 5 by 5 and take one row of 5 away and add it to the bottom, we get 6 by 4 with 1 left over. But however many holes there are on the side of the square, we can always move one row of holes down in a similar way to be left with a rectangle of holes with 1 left over.
Algebra was a huge breakthrough. Here was a new language to be able to analyse the way that numbers worked. Previously, the Indians and the Chinese had considered very specific problems, but Al-Khwarizmi went from the specific to the general. He developed systematic ways to be able to analyse problems so that the solutions would work whatever the numbers that you took. This language is the one that's used across the mathematical world today.
Al-Khwarizmi's great breakthrough came when he applied algebra to quadratic equations, that is, equations including numbers to the power of 2. The ancient Mesopotamians had devised a cunning method to solve particular quadratic equations. But it was Al-Khwarizmi's abstract language of algebra that could finally express why this method always worked. This was a great conceptual leap, and would ultimately lead to a formula that could be used to solve any quadratic equation, whatever the numbers involved. The next mathematical holy grail was to find a general method that could solve all cubic equations, equations including numbers to the power of 3. It was an 11th century Persian mathematician who took up the challenge of cracking the problem of the cubic. His name was Omar Khayyam, and he travelled widely across the Middle East, calculating as he went. But he was famous for another, very different reason. Khayyam was a celebrated poet, author of the great epic poem, the Rubaiyat.
Now, it may seem a bit odd that a poet was also a master mathematician. After all, the combination doesn't immediately spring to mind. But in fact, there's quite a lot of similarity between the two disciplines. Poetry, with its rhyming structure and rhythmic patterns, resonates quite strongly with constructing a logical mathematical proof.
Khayyam's major mathematical work was devoted to finding the general method to solve all cubic equations. Rather than looking at particular examples, Khayyam carried out a systematic analysis of the problem, true to the algebraic spirit of Al-Khwarizmi.
Khayyam's analysis revealed for the first time that there were several different sorts of cubic equation. But what held him back is that he was still very influenced by the geometric heritage of the Greeks. He couldn't separate the algebra from the geometry. In fact, he wouldn't even consider equations in higher degrees, because they described geometric objects in more than 3 dimensions, something he regarded as impossible. Although the geometry allowed him to analyse these cubic equations to some extent, he still couldn't come up with a purely algebraic solution.
It would be another 500 years before mathematicians could make the leap and find a general solution to the cubic equation. And that leap would finally be made in the West, in Italy. During the centuries in which China, India and the Islamic Empire had been in the ascendant, Europe had fallen under the shadow of the Dark Ages. All intellectual life, including the study of mathematics, had stagnated. But by the 13th century, things were beginning to change. Led by Italy, Europe was starting to explore and trade with the East. And with that contact came the spread of Eastern knowledge to the West. It was the son of a customs official that would become Europe's first great medieval mathematician. As a child, he travelled around North Africa with his father, where he learnt about the developments of Arabic mathematics, and especially the benefits of the Hindu-Arabic numerals. When he got home to Italy, he wrote a book that would be hugely influential in the development of Western mathematics. The mathematician was called Leonardo of Pisa, better known as Fibonacci. And in his Book of Calculating, Fibonacci promoted the new number system, demonstrating how simple it was compared to the Roman numerals that were in use across Europe. Calculations were far easier, a fact that had huge consequences for anyone dealing with numbers. Pretty much everyone, from mathematicians to merchants. But there was widespread suspicion of these new numbers. Old habits die hard, and the authorities just didn't trust them. Some believed that they would be more open to fraud, that you could tamper with them. Others believed that they'd be so easy to use for calculations that it would empower the masses, taking authority away from the intelligentsia, who knew how to use the old sort of numbers. The city of Florence even banned them in 1299. But over time, common sense prevailed. The new system spread throughout Europe, and the old Roman system slowly became defunct. At last, the Hindu-Arabic numerals 0 to 9 had triumphed.